Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today I'm going to be talking about the history of Dungeons & Dragons, year 6. So this is the 6th year of Dungeons & Dragons history, 1979. The game of Dungeons & Dragons has been out for 6 years now, and today I'm going to be talking about the history of Dungeons & Dragons through a filter called CLEAR. It's an acronym which means Catalyst, Location, Entity, Artifact, and Relationship. So who was the catalyst for Dungeons & Dragons in 1979? Well, it was a gentleman by the name of Mark Miller. And Mark Miller created Traveller. And Traveller was a super important tabletop role-playing game in the history of Dungeons & Dragons. And the reason why is Dungeons & Dragons creates the entire genre of tabletop role-playing games, okay? Now, the reality is, if Dungeons & Dragons is just a game on its own, then it's just a singular game. There are quite a few of these out there. There are games that are their own thing, and the creator creates them, and then nobody ever else creates anything in that genre of games. They don't take they don't take a core element of that rule set and build new games on it. But that's not the case with Dungeons & Dragons. The rule set, the player dungeon master structure, the polyhedral dice, the pen and paper, the table, all of those, people look at it and say, this is rock solid. I am going to create a new game like Dungeons & Dragons. The only thing I'm going to change is the setting, and I'm going to tweak a few of the rules. And that's exactly what Traveller is. But Traveller is hugely important to the history of Dungeons & Dragons because what it stands for and what it captured and the movement it gives to Dungeons & Dragons and tabletop role-playing games overall. And that is the establishment of Dungeons & Dragons as a commentator on American politics, American culture, and American society. Now, Traveller is making a bold statement about American politics, culture, and society because Traveller was a celebration of American and human space travel, right? Now, when you talk about a game celebrating human space travel in 1979, that means something, okay? Because it is exactly 1 decade away from the moon landing. So this is 1979. This is before the Challenger explosion. This is before 2019, a reality in which not a single country on the entire planet has put someone on the moon in decades. And cannot actually practically prove it even has the ability to put anybody on the moon, right? Where space travel is a footnote in humanity's past at the very best. And that when people talk about traveling to the moon or Mars, it's just as much fantasy as Dungeons & Dragons was fantasy, right? This is 1979 when the reality of human space travel was bright and vibrant, rather than now, today, where it is in all black and white, all gray tones, and is an anemic, frightening reality that really is. There's very little hope that humans are going to see the need to actually go out and actually populate even its own solar system, right? Which, by now, in 1979, there were people who really, really believed that we would have, light speed travel up and running soon and be hopping through wormholes and, colonizing other galaxies, right? Now people who talk about Mars are looked at like they're really talking about fantasy rather than science, right? And in some ways, it really has become a fantasy rather than science, because even though we have the technical capabilities, we don't have the will. Humanity really no longer has the will to travel to space, which is a hugely frightening and horrible reality. And then when I think about Traveller, and I think of what that game was saying and how it was pointing to Dungeons & Dragons, saying tabletop role-playing games are commentary on American politics, American culture, and American society, and how it was a celebration of human space travel, it really says a lot. So the catalyst for Dungeons & Dragons in 1979 was Mark Miller with the game Traveller. What's our location? Our location is Toronto, Canada. Our neighbors to the north, right? So Canada and America have had a fraught relationship for a long time. I think, there was a few decades maybe where we were really good, tight friends, but nowadays and, overall, Canada really lives a very different life. Canada as a nation lives a very different type of life than America. and often, from the Canadian side, it looks like Canada's kind of frowning on our structure. America looks at Canada and goes, you have a population that's maybe one of our states. Even if you guys are, doing something that we're not doing, what's it matter? We pretty much, you're living off of, what's your military like? Or maybe you leaning on the idea that we would help you if there was a problem, and maybe some of the money you're using on other things comes from the fact that we're, actually structuring half of your, or, that some of your military safety comes from proximity, right? So it's a fraught relationship, right? Even in 1979, there are tinges of that, right? But none of that matters to Dungeons and Dragons. Canada is getting hundreds and even thousands. Nobody has tens of thousands of copies at this point. This is 1979. The game is rolling out, but copies of the game are making it over the border, and our Canadian neighbors are very much taking to the game. And really, Dungeons and Dragons, even now in its sixth year, is finding communities of players in countries all over the world. It spread very, very quickly. The game was literally carried on planes, trains, ships, carried over borders by hand. And again, this is 1979. Travel was very different then, right? It was a very different world back then. But the game is really finding a home in Toronto, Canada in 1979. Who is our entity? Our entity is a woman by the name of Susan B. Anthony. So Susan B. Anthony is a historical figure in American society. She was a suffragette, and she fought very, very hard for the right for women to vote, right? Now, in 1979, Susan B. Anthony was honored in the United States of America with the Susan B. Anthony coin. That coin was worth $1, right? And you could take that coin and you could buy real things with it, because it's 1979. You could take yourself and a friend out and buy each of yourselves a nice cup of coffee, which would even get refills for $1, right? That's a nice get together, you know what I mean? To do that today, if you went to Starbucks and you bought your friend a coffee and yourself a coffee, you're out $10, right? $1 would not even pay, would barely pay for you to get a cup of coffee today, even at a discount shop, right? So $1 coffee is pretty rare today, and that would be for just one person. So that Susan B. Anthony coin, that one coin, honoring Susan B. Anthony, our entity for 1979, was the closest thing America would ever get to a gold piece, a single coin that had actual value and was used by commoners to buy goods, just like happens in the Dungeons and Dragons game with gold pieces. Our artifact for 1979 is hugely important. Our artifact for 1979 is the 1E, the first edition Dungeon Master Guide. The 1E Dungeon Master Guide is massively important because it determines a division, right? One of the things that we all take for granted was the DMG, the Player's Handbook, and the MM could all be put into one book. We know this now because Paizo proved it with Pathfinder. And they built a very strong, very robust tabletop role-playing game with a 500-page rule book that served literally hundreds of thousands, if not low millions of players, right? So it is absolutely viable to do the Player's Handbook, the DMG, and the Monster Manual all in one book, right? That can absolutely be done. It's been proven, right? But Dungeons & Dragons said, no, we're not doing that. We are going to give a separate book for the player. We're going to give a separate book for the Dungeon Master. And these two roles are integral to the game. And the game is now stating these players will need to read hundreds of pages of rules to play this game each. They each have responsibilities. They have divisions of knowledge that within the game, right? And there is a system mastery that belongs to the player, and there is a system mastery that belongs to the dungeon master. This is a critical division. This has never existed in any tabletop role-playing game before. And in 1979, with the DMG printed and available, sitting on the shelf right next to the PHB, we now see that this game is going in a direction that no other game has ever gone. It is creating a level of simulation that no other game has ever created. It is creating a level of complexity that no other game has ever created. It has a level of randomness with polyhedral dice, the full set of polyhedral dice, platonic shapes and non-platonic shapes being used in the polyhedral dice that dwarfs any game ever presented. And here we see with the DMG, Dungeons and Dragons is just zooming out. It's hitting the turbo, right? It's saying we're leaving everything behind. We've given you a glimpse of what this game is with the box set. We've shown it to you in its barest minimum form, but you're about to see us put the hammer down, and we're going to lay rubber, and there are going to be tracks on the road, right? And that's what the DMG is. It is a declaration, an exclamation point that Dungeons and Dragons is going places that no game has ever gone. And here, 45 years later, we know that declaration was not a false declaration. It was not bravado. It was truth. DMG, the Dungeons and Dragons, has become what no other game really has. A game, literature, and art, all in one, accessible to the masses at an affordable price, right? And allowing literally millions of stories to be told, inspiring thousands of other tabletop role-playing games, and thousands of other designers, and inspiring thousands of dungeon masters, and inspiring thousands of players, right? It is laying the groundwork for an entire genre, for a game platform, for a literature platform, for an art platform, blended in a way that has never been seen before, okay? What is our relationship for Dungeons and Dragons in 1979? Well, there is a product that comes out in 1979 that Dungeons and Dragons has a relationship to, and that is the Happy Meal. The Happy Meal is introduced by McDonald's in 1979, and the reason why the Happy Meal was brought out in 1979 was it was a declaration. This product was a declaration to the world and to America itself, saying, in America, our children get their own special meal. Right? Every other country in the world, pretty much, the children eat what the parents eat, right? Just in smaller portions. It's just taken out, right? But here in America, that's not the case. There's a special meal that includes a toy with every single meal. And this is available, again, to the masses. And it shapes American children, both literally and figuratively. It's saying, whenever you get a meal, you should get a toy, right? It's a massive declaration of the huge, voluminous wealth that we're about that has already shown up in America and is about to be multiplied in the 80s and the 90s. In the 80s, there was a huge boom from all kinds of stock market growth. And in the 90s, we would see the tech growth. And so all this wealth that's come out of World War II, come to America after World War II, after the Industrial Revolution, we're about to see all that multiplied in the 80s and the 90s. And the Happy Meal is an acknowledgement that America is like no nation in the world, okay? And that our children live differently than any children in the world. And our 12-year-olds, and that's where the game of Dungeons and Dragons starts. It's for 12 and up, okay? And there's this declaration and this acknowledgement, the relationship between Dungeons and Dragons and Happy Meals in the 1979. Now, at no point did TSR go, we have a relationship with the Happy Meal. We only see this looking back, right? But TSR had a very good sense that American children were not like any children in the world, and that you would get, just like we saw in Stranger Things, and I know this for a fact because I did it myself. When I was I started actually playing exactly when I was 12. I discovered the game when I was 10. I had to wait 2 years for my parents to buy me the red box when I was 12 years old, right? And they wouldn't buy it to me before that because they were alarmed, and they were right. The game said you should be 12 to play this, right? So I had to wait until I was 12 years old to get the red box, right? But 12-year-olds in America, children, right, are playing a game, and on summer days, on a Saturday, are starting at noon and playing until 8 or 9 o'clock at night, playing 8 or 9 hour games. And they're doing this by the hundreds, by the thousands, by the tens of thousands, right? And this is only in America. We absolutely see that the game is spreading, but it's being picked up by adults in other nations. And maybe a few children are playing it. But in America, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of children are playing Dungeons and Dragons in the 80s and the 90s, right? And this starts with the recognition in 1979 by TSR that 12-year-olds are part of the market. They didn't make this an adult product. They're saying American children should have access to this. And we're going to shape this game so that they do have access to it, right? And so that, in my opinion, solidifies that relationship between Dungeons & Dragons and the Happy Meal. They're similar. They're this unique, special product that really only grows in the soil of America, right? I really believe Dungeons & Dragons was created in America and grew in America because it's the only place it could have been created, right? It's the only, right? It is, and you know, and here also we're seeing that cementing that Dungeons & Dragons is an element of Americana, just like jazz, just like baseball, just like comic books, right? It's just a wonderful, beautiful thing. That is the J. Scott Garibay Clear History of Dungeons & Dragons in the year 1979, the 6th year of Dungeons & Dragons history. I'd love to know your thoughts on Dungeons & Dragons in 1979. What was your experience with the game then? And then also, please consider liking and subscribing. Thank you very much.